the reality is that these kids, all young people, are seeing culture, they're going to school, they're being educated, and their political beliefs are being shaped in this way. And it's having a terrible effect on them. You look at I read in my last segment the Coomberree River Collective statement drafted in 1977. And this statement is clear. It says, black feminists often talk about their feelings of craziness before becoming conscious of the concepts of sexual politics, patriarchal rule, and most importantly, feminism. The political analysis and practice that we women use to struggle against our oppression. So they're saying basically we needed to be inducted into the concepts that are being taught by this ideological theory before we could see that we were victims, right? And that's what the education system is doing. And they go, we realise that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolved from a healthy love of ourselves, etc., etc. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. We realise that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic system of capitalism and imperialism, etc. And they go on to affirm Karl Marx. Now, why do I read that? Well, because here's the thing. This is what the education system does. It says, look inside, ask, who am I? Answer that question in these categories that this critical theory we're teaching you is giving you. Oh, I'm black, I'm female, I'm this, I'm that, and you select your categories off of the smorgasbord, which is given, and then you say, all right, now I know that I'm a victim. Now I know that in the eyes of society, I am oppressed. And I must fight against that oppression. And I'm angry about that oppression. And this is injustice. And away they go. And I'm a goodie. And the society is the baddie. And the people who don't share my characteristics. It's kind of like this narcissistic individualism which flows over into this sort of Marxist revolution. And this is cultural Marxism. It says, who am I? And that brings about a victim mindset. You know, it's a bit like giving a microscope to a biologist so they can see bacteria. You give a kid critical theory so they can see that they're victims. And that's precisely what's happening. But I want to mention two biblical examples that contrast to what's being taught at the moment, to what we're seeing and hearing all around us, especially in the mainstream media, actually. I'd like to mention the biblical example, firstly, of Cain and Abel, and secondly, of Jonah. Cain and Abel, that's the first story really to take place in a fallen world in Genesis 4. And you know, Cain started to see something in his life. He started to see that he and his brother seemed to be unequal in some way, that Abel appeared to have privilege. And the section talks about his favour with God. Maybe he was also the favoured younger son, who knows? But things are good for Abel, and Cain is suddenly becoming aware of this sense that things are not as good for him. So Cain feels that he doesn't have that privilege, and he decides that he's a victim and his situation is unjust. But here's the point, he says it's Abel's fault. And it turns out that even in a society of just one family, there is oppression. But God warns Cain about where his thinking is taking him. He says, sin is crouching at your door. Cain had two options. He could take moral agency, he could take responsibility, he could do right, and he could do good. But he took option B. He let sin in that was crouching at the door. It had its way with him. He overthrew his oppressor. He killed him. And that actually was the true beginning of his pain. Do you know something? Every single person faces challenges in life. Everyone. It's part of the human condition that we do suffer, that our situation is not perfect, that life throws up tremendous challenges. Identity politics doesn't know the half of it. They name a bunch of trendy categories and say, oh, well, you might be oppressed in these categories. The truth is, there's far more categories than that. Life is far worse than they think. The fall in the previous chapter, in Genesis chapter 3, has revealed to us that there's no utopia on this earth. Every life faces its disadvantages. But what we do about those disadvantages is a deeply moral question. The truth is, the most basic struggle we face is not between groups over power. The most basic division is not tribes of identity politics. The most basic division is good and evil, and the most basic struggle is the struggle of my own heart and your own heart to do good and shun evil. And the thing that will oppress you more than anything else is immoral behavior and rebellion against God's goodness. That is the life of true oppression. It was Cain's biggest problem at the start. Read the story, you'll see it. It was an even bigger problem at the end. That is not to say that there isn't genuine struggles in life that are not our fault. It's not your fault all the time. But here's the thing. How you respond is a deeply moral question. That's the lesson of Cain and Abel. The second story is that of Jonah. And you know, Jonah's story ends abruptly with him sitting in a hopeless despond. And from his seat in the dust, he cries out to God. He says, I do well to be angry. And you know, a major part of Jonah's problem was that he actually believed that he was a victim. I'm sure he did have his share of disadvantages, as everyone who ever lived has done. But his inward self-focus on his own situation bent his whole perspective out of shape. He was commissioned as an evangelist to a particularly godless people. But he didn't want to see others blessed because they didn't deserve it in his mind. He wanted to see them punished. I say, well, does that sound familiar? His prayer was heard from the belly of the fish and God saved him. But he ultimately loses sight of that blessing too when he declares, it is better for me to die than to live. The sun was burning his head when he sat out in the dust, but God caused the green plant to grow up and it gave him shade. But Jonah really only remembered and focused on the loss of that plant because he became very angry over it. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, while he's looking within and he's saying, this is how I feel, this is how the universe is against me, an entire city, and a big one at that, was literally being saved. You know, when you turn in on yourself and you see the world only through a lens of your own disadvantages and miseries, that is through your victim status, and we all have a victim status somewhere and somehow, you become blind to goodness itself. You become angry, and it's a terribly ugly thing. But you know, so long as Jesus lives, you're no victim. Not only do you have all the blessings of God's common grace every day, but he offers me everything, no matter who we are. When we deserve nothing, no matter who we are. Through one Saviour, no matter who we are, who gave up everything for you and for me, no matter who we are, to know God, no matter who we are. Do you know the God of the universe offers every single one of us the greatest equality in the world? And all of us, metaphorically, need to get out of our seat in the dust and realise that, because it changes everything. I'm Mark Niles, and that was the truth of it.